Imagine a 17-year-old girl, born in a small farming village in France, with no army, no power, no training, and yet she walks into history like she already owns it. She stands in front of broken soldiers, a country falling apart, and a war everyone believes is already lost. Then she does the impossible. She leads an army. This is the story of Joan of Arc, the girl who changed the fate of France before she even became an adult. The early life Joan of Arc was born in the year 1412 in a small rural village called Domremy, located in the eastern part of France. It was not a place known for power, wealth, or influence. Life there was slow, simple, and closely connected to the land. Families worked in fields, raised animals, and depended on each season to survive. There were no signs that this village would ever produce someone whose name would be remembered across centuries. Her family lived the same kind of life as everyone else around them. They were farmers, not nobles or wealthy landowners. Every day required physical work, patience, and endurance. There was no comfort of privilege, no access to formal education in politics or warfare, and no connection to royal courts or important institutions. Joan grew up learning the basics of survival, rather than the language of leadership or battle. From a social point of view, her future looked ordinary and predictable. Girls born in her position were expected to remain within the limits of village life, helping their families and continuing the same cycle their parents had lived before them. Nothing in her background suggested she would ever stand near kings or armies. Yet even in those early years, people noticed something unusual about her. She was deeply connected to her faith in a way that felt stronger than most children her age. Religion was not just a tradition for her. It shaped how she understood the world. She prayed often, reflected quietly, and seemed to carry a serious sense of purpose even while still very young. Along with this, she showed emotional strength that surprised those around her. In situations where other children might feel afraid or uncertain, she appeared steady and focused. There was also a quiet determination in her personality. When she believed something was right, she did not easily step away from it. This quality made her stand out in small but noticeable ways, even though she lived a very ordinary rural life. But while Joan was growing up in this quiet village, the world beyond it was facing chaos. France, during this time, was trapped in a long and exhausting conflict known as the 100 Years' War. The country was not united. Different regions were controlled or influenced by opposing forces, and there was constant struggle over land and leadership. The people of France were tired, uncertain, and surrounded by fear of what might come next. Cities and villages felt the pressure of ongoing conflict. Resources were limited, trust in leadership was weakening, and hope was slowly fading in many places. Instead of feeling like a strong kingdom, France felt divided and unstable. This was the environment Joan was born into, a peaceful village life on one side, and a collapsing nation on the other. The calling when Joan reached about 13 years of age, her life began to change in a way she could not easily explain to others. She described moments where she felt a presence speaking to her, not through sound in the ordinary sense, but as a strong inner voice that felt real and undeniable to her. She believed these voices were not random thoughts. In her understanding, they were messages from holy figures, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These were names she had grown up hearing in religious teachings, figures associated with protection, guidance, and purity. According to her account, these voices did not confuse her. Instead, they gave her direction. They did not speak about ordinary things like daily life or small personal choices. They spoke about responsibility. They spoke about purpose. They suggested that her life was meant for something beyond the village she lived in. She was young and unsure how to interpret what she was experiencing. But over time, the messages became more consistent and direct. She felt as if she was being prepared for something important, something that would affect not just her own life, but the fate of others. By the time she turned 17, the message had become clear in her mind. She believed she was being told to go and help save France. This was not a simple or safe idea. She had no training in warfare, no experience in leadership, and no connection to military power. She was a young woman from a farming family, living in a country that was already struggling under war and political pressure. From a practical point of view, there was nothing that made her suitable for such a task. But Joan did not rely on practical certainty. What pushed her forward was something stronger in her belief system, a sense of faith that she could not ignore. Acting on this conviction, she made a decision that would completely separate her life from everything she had known. She left her home and stepped into a world she had never experienced before. carrying nothing except her determination and the belief that she had been given a purpose. When she first approached people in positions of authority, she was not taken seriously. A young girl claiming a divine mission was not something military leaders were prepared to accept easily. Still, she refused to turn back. Through persistence and confidence that surprised those around her, she eventually gained the attention of a local captain. He did not immediately reject her claim. Instead, something about her certainty made him consider her words. This small opening became the first real step toward something much larger. From there, her journey reached even higher levels. She was eventually brought before the Dauphin, the man who would later become the King of France. Convincing him was not easy. He was surrounded by advisors, politics, and constant pressure from the war. Trust was not given quickly in such an environment. Yet, Joan managed to reach him in a way that others had not. Whether through her confidence, her conviction, or the unusual nature of her story, she gained his attention and slowly began to earn his trust. An unlikely path began to form, one that would take her from a small village into the center of a national struggle. The impossible leadership. When Joan was finally given a position with the army, she entered a situation that was already broken in spirit. The soldiers she met were not confident warriors full of energy or discipline. They were men who had been pushed back again and again, carrying the weight of repeated defeats. Many of them had seen battles where hope disappeared early, replaced by fear, exhaustion, and doubt about whether victory was even possible anymore. Their condition was not just physical tiredness. It was something deeper. They no longer fully believed in success. When an army reaches that point, even weapons and numbers stop feeling powerful. What remains is hesitation, uncertainty, and silence before action. Into this environment, Joan arrived. She did not come with a long military career behind her. She did not bring years of battlefield experience or formal training and strategy. What she carried instead was something different, a level of certainty that people around her could immediately feel. Many of the soldiers likely saw her as unusual. A young woman stepping into a space dominated by experienced fighters would normally be ignored or doubted. But Joan did not behave like someone uncertain of her place. She did not hesitate in her movements or her speech. She did not present herself as someone asking for permission. She acted as if she already knew the direction forward. That attitude began to affect the people around her in ways that words alone could not. Something shifted in the atmosphere of the camp. The same men who had been silent or discouraged started to pay attention when she spoke. Her instructions were not long or complicated, but they were delivered with clarity and firmness. She did not overload them with unnecessary explanations. Instead, she focused on direction, action, and belief in what could still be achieved. More importantly, she showed no sign of fear when others expected hesitation. In moments where doubt normally spread, she remained steady. That stability began to influence the soldiers more than they probably realized. It was not only what she said that mattered, but the way she carried herself while saying it. Little by little, the emotional condition of the army started to change. Men who had stopped believing in victory began to reconsider what was possible. Conversations that once revolved around defeat slowly shifted toward preparation. Confidence, even in small amounts, began to return. Joan's leadership did not rely on force or authority in the traditional sense. She did not rule through rank or long-established military power. Instead, her influence came from presence, conviction, and the ability to hold her ground when everything around her had already given up. Because of this, she was not simply giving orders to soldiers. She was rebuilding belief inside them. And in an army where hope had nearly disappeared, that belief became the first real sign that something could still change. The Battle of Orléans, the moment that would define Joan's place in history, arrived at Orléans, a city that had become a symbol of pressure and fear during the war. It was surrounded, cut off, and slowly weakening under constant attack. For many people in France at that time, Orléans represented something larger than just one location. It reflected the condition of the entire country. If the city fell, it felt like the rest of the nation could follow. Inside and around it, tension had built up for a long time. Supplies were limited, communication was unstable, and the people defending the city were exhausted from continuous fighting. Each passing day made the situation heavier, and hope became harder to hold on to. When Joan arrived with the French forces, she entered this environment at its most fragile point. Nothing about the situation was simple. The enemy forces were strong, the defenders were worn down, and the outcome seemed uncertain. Yet Joan stepped into command with the same steady conviction she had shown before. She did not treat the situation as already decided. Instead, she focused on action. She moved with the soldiers, spoke directly to them, and made it clear that hesitation would not lead to change. Her presence on the battlefield was not distant or symbolic. She was physically there, sharing the same risks and the same conditions as the fighters around her. During the fighting, she was wounded. The injury could have forced her to withdraw, as it would for most commanders, but she did not leave the field. She continued to remain visible among the soldiers, refusing to let pain or danger interrupt her involvement in the moment. That decision had a visible effect. The soldiers who saw her staying on the front lines responded differently. Something inside the group shifted again, not through strategy alone, but through the example she set. When people who were already tired saw their leader refusing to step back, their own hesitation began to fade. The energy of the army changed direction. What had once been a defensive struggle began to feel more active, more driven. Movements became more coordinated, and confidence returned in a way that had not been present before. Step by step, the French forces pushed forward. The pressure that had held them back for so long began to break. The situation that once looked fixed started to open in unexpected ways. Against expectations that had been built over months of difficulty, the outcome shifted. The French achieved victory at Orléans. It was not just a military success. It marked a turning point in morale, perception, and belief. A moment that had once seemed like a slow collapse became a reversal that few had predicted. From that moment onward, Joan was no longer seen in the same way as before. She was given a name that reflected what people believed she had accomplished there: the Maid of Orléans. It was a title born not from position or authority, but from a single event where determination and action changed the direction of a city that many thought was already lost. Victory and rising power. After the breakthrough at Orléans, something important began to change across France. The atmosphere of constant retreat and fear slowly started to shift into movement in the opposite direction. What once felt like a nation pushed backward now began to show signs of advance. The French forces, who had spent a long time defending and reacting, started to take initiative again. Towns and regions that had been under pressure began to change hands. Each small victory added weight to the idea that the situation was no longer fixed. Step by step, the sense of collapse that had dominated earlier began to weaken. This change in momentum was not just about land or territory. It also affected how people thought. Soldiers who had once expected defeat started to believe that progress was possible. Communities that had been living under uncertainty began to see the possibility of stability returning. The idea that France could recover no longer felt distant or unrealistic. One of the most significant outcomes of this shift was the coronation of the king. For a long time, this moment had seemed uncertain, almost unreachable, because of the political and military chaos surrounding the country. Yet after the victories inspired by Joan's involvement, the path toward it finally opened. The coronation was not only a formal ceremony, it carried meaning far beyond tradition. It represented the return of structure and legitimacy at a time when everything had been unstable. For many people, it marked a point where France was no longer only surviving, but beginning to rebuild its identity. Success rarely brings only unity. As Joan's influence grew, so did the attention surrounding her role. She was no longer just seen as a participant in the war. She had become a figure people talked about, followed, and associated with major changes in direction. This growing visibility created discomfort in certain parts of the political and military structure. In environments where power is closely shared and carefully balanced, sudden shifts in influence can create tension. Not everyone was comfortable with how much attention she was receiving, or how strongly her presence affected decisions. As victories continued, the contrast between support and resistance became more noticeable. While many respected her contribution, others began to question her position. Concerns, doubts, and political calculations slowly started to form around her role in the ongoing conflict. This shift in perception led to growing opposition from powerful individuals who once may have been neutral or supportive. What began as admiration in the early stages gradually turned into disagreement in certain circles. Joan, who had once been welcomed as a symbol of hope, was now entering a phase where success itself was creating new challenges. Not on the battlefield, but among the people who held influence behind the scenes. Betrayal, trial, and capture. As Joan's influence grew, the situation around her began to shift in a way that became increasingly dangerous. The same war that once placed her in a position of leadership slowly turned into a network of political tension, shifting alliances, and hidden decisions made far from the battlefield. At some point during this unstable period, Joan was captured by opposing forces. It was not a moment of open battlefield defeat where armies clashed directly, and one side clearly overpowered the other. Instead, it happened in a more complex and quiet way, shaped by the unstable politics of the time. What made the situation even more serious was what followed after her capture. She was not simply treated as a prisoner of war in the usual sense. Instead, she was transferred between groups and eventually handed over in a way that reflected political interests rather than military fairness. Her fate was no longer controlled by soldiers on the battlefield, but by decisions made through negotiation and authority. Soon after, she was placed on trial. However, this was not a process where both sides were equally heard, or where evidence was fairly examined. From the beginning, the structure of the trial gave little space for her defense to truly change the outcome. The direction of events had already been strongly influenced before she even stood before the judges. During the proceedings, Joan was questioned repeatedly. The environment was not calm or supportive. She was placed under pressure, surrounded by authority figures who challenged her statements and attempted to break her confidence. She was also kept in conditions of isolation, separated from normal support or comfort, making the experience even more difficult to endure. Despite everything happening around her, Joan did not abandon her beliefs. She remained consistent in what she had always said. Even when facing fear, confusion, and intense pressure, her responses did not shift based on the situation she was in. She continued to stand by her perspective, even when it placed her in greater danger. At just 19 years old, her life reached its final judgment. The court delivered a sentence that marked the end of the process. She was condemned to death. The execution that followed was carried out publicly, in a way meant to serve as a warning in that era. Joan was burned at the stake, bringing her short life to a tragic and violent end. In a matter of moments, the girl who had once inspired armies and influenced a nation's direction was gone, leaving behind a story that would continue far beyond the time she lived. Legacy that never died. After many years passed, the story of Joan of Arc did not simply fade away as most historical events eventually do. Instead, people began to look back at what had happened with a different level of reflection. The same actions, the same trial, and the same decisions were re-examined in a calmer time, when emotions of war and conflict had settled. With distance from the events, doubts about the fairness of her trial began to grow. Questions were raised about how the process had been conducted, what influenced the decisions, and whether she had truly been given a fair chance to defend herself. Over time, this deeper examination led to a very different conclusion than the one reached during her lifetime. She was officially declared innocent. This recognition did not bring her back, but it changed how history understood her story. The image of her life shifted from one shaped by judgment and execution to one shaped by courage, conviction, and resilience in the face of overwhelming pressure. As centuries continued, her story gained an even larger meaning. She was later recognized as Saint Joan of Arc, a title that placed her within a spiritual and cultural legacy that extended far beyond politics or war. This recognition reflected how deeply her life had impacted memory, identity, and belief systems over time. What makes her story powerful is not just what she achieved on the battlefield, but what her life came to represent afterward. A young girl from a simple village, with no formal training, no military background, and no access to power, became someone whose name continued to be spoken long after her time ended. She crossed the boundaries of her own era and entered a space in history where her actions were no longer limited to one country or one moment. Her journey became a symbol that people across generations could interpret in their own way. For some, it represents faith held under pressure. For others, it reflects courage in the face of authority. For many, it shows what it means to stand by a belief even when the entire environment pushes in the opposite direction. Today, her story is still told, not as a simple historical record, but as something that continues to carry meaning. It reminds people that strength is not always about age, position, or experience. Sometimes it is about conviction that does not break under pressure. And that is why her legacy has not ended. It continues to exist wherever people struggle with doubt, resistance, or fear of standing alone, quietly reminding them that even a single voice can leave a mark that lasts far beyond a lifetime. And when you look at Joan of Arc's story, it doesn't feel like just history anymore. It feels like a question left for us. A girl with no army, no training, no power, yet she changed the direction of a nation simply because she refused to give up on what she believed. So think about this for a moment. What becomes possible in your life if you hold on to your courage the same way? Maybe history is not only something we read, maybe it is something we are still capable of writing. If this story touched you, stay with us, because more voices from the past are still waiting to be heard.